This presentation on the harmony of science and religion compares the findings of some of the leading scientists of the 20th century with scriptures from various faiths, seeking to find points of commonality between them. We begin with two quotes from Abdu'l-Baha. He's the son of the founder of the Baha'i faith. Abdu'l-Baha lived primarily in the 19th century. He wrote, "Should a man try to fly with the wing of religion alone, he would quickly fall into the quagmire of superstition, whilst on the other hand, with the wing of science alone, he would also make no progress, but fall into the despairing slough of materialism." Abdu'l-Baha also quotes Ali, the son-in-law of Muhammad, saying, "That which is in conformity with science is also in conformity with religion." And Abdu'l-Baha is suggesting here that Ali and Islam recognize the unity of scientific findings and religious beliefs. And in fact, if you think back to the period prior to the Renaissance in Europe, the Muslim scholars were leading the world in their discoveries. So it makes sense that Islam championed science at that time and that there was commonality in belief between the scriptures and the scientific findings. Here are some quotes on creation of the universe. From a Hindu scripture, we have this quote that in the beginning there was nothing in the universe. The Brahman alone was everywhere. The universe was shrouded in darkness. So again, this is from Hindu scripture. Now, what do scientists say today about the Big Bang and the origin of the universe? Here's a quote that summarizes that. It says, "Modern cosmologists believe that our known universe started as an extremely small patch of vacuum. Because of absence of light, it must have been dark." So when you have a vacuum in space, there's no light. And it seems consistent, the scientific view, with the Hindu perspective that there was darkness at the beginning of the universe. Now, if we look to the Judeo-Christian tradition, we can go to the book of Genesis, which you'll find both in the Torah and in the Bible. And here from the King James Bible, we read, "And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And God said, let there be light, and there was light." So again, we have this concept that there was darkness at the beginning, and then there was light. This quote also says that the earth was without form. So let's compare that with a Baha'i quote from Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith. And this would have been written in the 19th century. Baha'u'llah wrote, "That which hath been in existence had existed before, but not in the form thou seest today. The world of existence came into being through the heat generated from the interaction between the active force and that which is its recipient." So again, we see a change in form, and we see a progression from darkness to light, or from no heat to heat. So it's very interesting to compare these quotes and see how much commonality there is between them. Now let's look at subatomic particles. Here's a quote that refers to, again, Hindu scriptures. "One cannot say certainly that the particle is at a particular place. Similar to the description of Brahman in the scripture Ishopanishad, it moves and it moves not, it is far and it is near, it is within all this and it is also outside all this." So what is this telling us? This is telling us that the Hindu scriptures suggest that the essence of everything moves but also doesn't move. It's both far and near. It's within and it is also outside. This is similar to what scientists have found with quantum physics, that subatomic particles do not seem to be restricted to place and time. So they can be in multiple places at the same time. They could be moving and still, perhaps, at the same time. One of the great quantum scientists of the 20th century, Heisenberg, he actually studied Indian philosophy, as did several of his peers. And he stated, after the conversations about Indian philosophy, some of the ideas of quantum physics that had seemed so crazy suddenly made much more sense. So he found commonality between his findings in quantum physics and the statements he was reading in Eastern philosophies and religions. Now, time and space, according to Einstein, are relative, meaning they are not absolute. They can change. Let's read what Abdu'l-Baha had to say. Pay special attention to the end of this quote. He wrote, "It is therefore clear that the spirit has powerful perceptions that are not mediated by the organs of the five senses. There exists among spiritual souls a unity that surpasses all imagination and comparison, and a communion that transcends time and place." So Abdu'l-Baha is suggesting that spiritual souls can communicate without limitations of time and place. This would be similar to what quantum physicists have found about subatomic particles. Einstein also, again, he created the theory of relativity. Here is a quote from Einstein that talks about time. He says, "People like us who believe in physics know that the distinction between past and present and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion." So, according to Einstein, time is an illusion. Here's a brief quote that sort of summarizes the scientific and quantum physics view of time and subatomic particles. It says, "Instantaneous action or transfer of information does appear to be possible." In other words, it appears to be possible from scientific research for a subatomic particle to be in multiple places at the same time, or for information to transfer instantaneously across space. This seems very different to what we're used to in our perception of matter, but this is what scientists find in quantum physics. Now, Baha'u'llah made a very interesting statement in the 19th century that seems to refer to nuclear energy. He wrote, "Strange and astonishing things exist in the earth, and they are hidden from the minds and the understanding of men. These things are capable of changing the whole atmosphere of the earth. Lightning or a force similar to it is controlled by an operator and moveth at his command." Baha'u'llah also refers to this energy as something that could be very destructive and could actually even destroy the whole earth, potentially. That seems to be a prediction of nuclear energy, but again, this statement was made in the 19th century. Baha'u'llah's great-grandson, Shoghi Effendi, in 1938, wrote something that seems to predict the internet. Notice in this quote, he's talking about a mechanism of intercommunication, not just communication, which could be associated with telegraphs and telephones, but intercommunication, which seems to suggest more of a network or internet. And Shoghi Effendi wrote in 1938, "A mechanism of world intercommunication will be devised embracing the whole planet, freed from national hindrances and restrictions, and functioning with marvelous swiftness and perfect regularity." Now some quotes on consciousness, the first two being from Abdu'l-Baha. Abdu'l-Baha is referring to the spirit and the soul, and if you replace those concepts with consciousness, you'll see a lot of similarity with what the quantum physicists say about consciousness. First, Abdu'l-Baha says, the spirit is as the lamp, and the mind as the light that shines from it. So he's saying that the mind comes from the spirit. He goes on to say, the human spirit did not descend into this body. On the contrary, the rational soul is the substance upon which the body depends. So it's not that our soul or consciousness is the product of the body, but the body actually depends on the soul or consciousness. Max Planck, who was one of the leading physicists of the 20th century, said, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. So here is a leading physicist saying that what is fundamental in the universe is not matter, it's consciousness, and that matter comes from consciousness. Similar to how Abdu'l-Baha says the body and the mind come from the soul or the spirit. Abdu'l-Baha also says the rational soul is endowed from the beginning with individuality. It does not acquire it through the intermediary of the body. So he's saying that our souls have individuality. A current philosopher, Bernardo Kastrup, wrote the following: living beings, these are images of processes of self-localization of consciousness, like a whirlpool is the image of a process of self-localization of water. So Kastrup here is saying that consciousness is like a sea, and we are all part of that sea, but we are also individual. We're like individual whirlpools in the interconnected sea of consciousness. That seems consistent with what Abdu'l-Baha is writing about the soul being fundamental, but also having individuality. Let's continue this concept of oneness. Abdu'l-Baha wrote, in the same way that the parts, members, and organs of the human body are interconnected, so too are the parts and members of this endless universe connected with and spiritually and materially influenced by one another. So he's saying the entire universe is interconnected, and that seems consistent with what the great physicists have said. There does seem to be interconnectedness. We have concepts like the space-time continuum, and we have these concepts of dark energy and dark matter that we don't really understand, but they seem to be pervasive throughout the universe, suggesting that there is some sort of connectedness in the universe. Abdu'l-Baha goes on to say, and although our present methods and sciences cannot detect these relationships among the universal beings, their existence is nonetheless clear and indisputable. So let's compare that with a couple quotes here from Schrödinger, again, one of the leading physicists of the 20th century, and also a student of Eastern philosophy and religion, particularly Vedanta. And Schrödinger wrote, the plurality that we perceive is only an appearance. It is not real. Vedantic philosophy has sought to clarify it by a number of analogies. One of the most attractive being the many-faceted crystal, which while showing hundreds of little pictures of what is in reality a single existent object, does not really multiply that object. So what Schrödinger is saying here is that a crystal can take an image and make it seem like many images. In the same way, what we perceive as plurality in the universe is actually one essence that has been multiplied. Schrödinger also said, the unity and continuity of Vedanta are reflected in the unity and continuity of wave mechanics. This is entirely consistent with the Vedanta concept of all in one. So Schrödinger studied, for example, how subatomic particles can be both particles, they could have an individuality, and they can be waves where they are connected to a field. So it's pretty interesting to study quantum physics and see how fascinating it is. And there seems to be even an impact where the researcher that's studying the particle is actually influencing whether that is a particle or is a wave by the fact that they're studying it. There's this interconnectedness between the observer and the observed, the researcher and the researched. So it's pretty fascinating to read what Schrödinger found in terms of the oneness and what appears to be multiplicity in the universe. Now, Alan Turing was another great scientist of the 20th century. You might recognize his name from the movie The Imitation Game, which was about him, really. And he was one of the founders of computers and artificial intelligence. And he looked at the scientific evidence surrounding telepathy and did not want to believe it was true, but because of the overwhelming scientific evidence, he had to accept that telepathy, or the ability for two human beings to communicate from separate locations, that seemed to be a possibility. It seemed that the science showed that it was actually the case. Specifically, what he wrote was, unfortunately, the statistical evidence, at least for telepathy, is overwhelming. So here you have one of the great scientists saying, it looks like humans have the ability to communicate mind to mind somehow across space. Now, of course, we don't all master that ability, but there's enough scientific evidence that this exists that he referred to it. And it also seems to tie into this whole concept of consciousness not being restricted to space and time, of all of us somehow being connected to some universal consciousness, even though we have our individual consciousness. Finally, Schrödinger wrote, there is obviously only one alternative, namely the unification of minds or consciousness. Their multiplicity is only apparent. In truth, there is only one mind. So according to Schrödinger, there is some sort of universal consciousness that we all tap into. We don't know how. We don't really understand the mechanics behind it, but it seems consistent with the way quantum physics explains things that operate at the quantum level. It seems consistent from what we know about consciousness. So there seems to be a great deal of harmony between what the leading scientists of the 20th century and the religions of the world have said about consciousness, about reality, and about oneness.